The muffled sobs of a terrified 4-year-old boy were completely swallowed by the chaotic noise of an upscale Chicago shopping galleria. Busy shoppers stepped around the crying child with irritated glances, not one of them willing to stop. But Gabrielle Montgomery couldn't walk away. She knelt down on the polished marble floor. Gently brushing the tears from his trembling cheeks, and softly began to sing a rare, forgotten Sicilian lullaby that her grandmother once used to whisper to her on quiet, starlit nights. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Table Number 6, and if you're watching from another country, drop your country's name in the comments below. We'd love to know where our amazing viewers are watching from around the world. She didn't know that the boy's uncle was Lorenzo Costa, the ruthless head of the city's most feared crime syndicate. When Lorenzo rounded the corner, his blood ran cold. He froze, staring at the ordinary woman holding his nephew, and whispered to his enforcer, "Find everything about her now." The air inside the Beaumont Galleria was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and freshly roasted espresso. It was a Tuesday afternoon in mid-November, the kind of day when Chicago's elite descended upon the luxury bout to avoid the biting wind sweeping off Lake Michigan. Gabrielle Montgomery, a 28-year-old speech pathologist, was only there to find a retirement gift for her clinic director, Arthur Pendleton. She felt entirely out of place in her worn wool coat and scuffed leather boots, surrounded by women clutching Birkin bags. She was about to leave an overpriced watch boutique when she heard a raw, guttural sound of pure panic. Near the massive marble fountain in the center of the promenade, a little boy was standing completely alone. He couldn't have been older than 4. He was dressed in a pristine navy peacoat and tiny tailored trousers, but his face was red and streaked with tears. Shoppers, too, consumed by their own importance, merely stepped around him. Some cast irritated glances. Others pretended not to see him at all. Gabrielle's professional instincts kicked in immediately. She pushed her way through a throng of businessmen and dropped to her knees right in front of the fountain. The boy flinched, taking a stumbling step backward. His tiny fists clutched tightly at his sides. "Hey there, sweetheart," Gabrielle said, keeping her voice low and melodic, avoiding direct, intimidating eye contact. "Are you lost? Where is your mummy or daddy?" The boy just shook his head violently, a fresh wave of tears spilling over his dark eyelashes. He babbled something incoherent, his breathing jagged and hyperventilating. It wasn't English. Gabrielle listened closely. The cadence, the clipped consonants, it was Italian. Gabrielle's heart. Her late grandmother, Rosa, had immigrated from a tiny, secluded village near Palmo, Sicily. Rosa had never quite mastered English, so Gabrielle had grown up surrounded by the rapid-fire warmth of the regional dialect. Without overthinking, Gabrielle switched languages. "Piccolo. It's all right, little one," she murmured smoothly, holding out one open, non-threatening hand. "Non panja somi. Don't cry. I am here." The boy stopped crying for a fraction of a second, his wide, dark eyes locking onto hers. He sniffled, taking a hesitant half-step forward, but the booming echo of the mall was still terrifying him. He began to tremble again, looking frantically left and right. Gabrielle knew she needed to ground him. She needed something familiar, something rhythmic to regulate his breathing. Digging deep into her childhood memories, she remembered the song her grandmother sang during violent thunderstorms in Boston. It wasn't a standard Italian lullaby. It was a highly specific generational folk song from her grandmother's isolated village, altered with a unique lyrical twist about a wolf and a mockingbird. Gabrielle pulled the boy gently by his shoulders, letting him bury his face into her coat, and began to hum. Then she sang softly the old Sicilian words, rolling off her tongue with native fluidity. "Nina nana hilo non trelusciolino. The blind wolf won't find you. The little bird will protect you." The effect was instantaneous. the boy's rigid muscles relaxed. He let out a long, shuddering sigh, his tiny hands gripping the lapels of her coat as he melted against her chest. He was safe. What Gabriel didn't see was the tidal wave of panic currently sweeping through the upper echelon of the Chicago underworld. Less than 50 yards away, Lorenzo Costa was tearing through the Galleria like a force of nature. Lorenzo was a man who commanded entire city blocks with a mere nod. At 32, he was the undisputed head of the Costa family. He was a ghost to law enforcement, a myth to the streets, and a nightmare to his enemies. Dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit, his face was a mask of cold, lethal fury. Flanking him were 4 heavily armed men, shoving civilians out of the way without a word of apology. His nephew, Mateo, had slipped away from his security detail for exactly 90 seconds. 90 seconds was all it took for an assassination or a kidnapping. Lorenzo was prepared to burn the entire Galleria to the foundation if the boy was harmed. As Lorenzo rounded the marble pillar near the fountain, his right-hand man, Dominic Rossi, pointed, "Boss, there, dead." He saw his nephew safe clinging to a woman in a cheap, brown coat. The violent, suffocating panic in Lorenzo's chest began to subside until he heard her voice. He held up a hand, halting his men. He stepped closer, silently, his custom leather shoes making no sound on the marble. The woman was singing. Lorenzo's blood turned to ice in his veins. The air in his lungs evaporated. Lupo non roa. It was impossible. That song, that exact phrasing about the blind wolf. It wasn't just a Sicilian folk song. It was the specific altered version his mother had made up when Lorenzo was a child. She had sung it to him to hide the sounds of gunfire outside their old apartment. His mother had been dead for 15 years, gunned down by a rival faction. Only 3 people in the world knew those exact lyrics. His mother, Lorenzo, and Lorenzo's late sister, Mateo's mother. Who the hell was this woman? Lorenzo stepped out of the shadow of the pillar. Mateo. His voice was a low, commanding baritone that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Gabriel jumped, startled. She looked up and felt the breath knock out of her. The man standing over her was easily 6'3", with sharp aristocratic features, piercing dark eyes, and an aura of such intense, suffocating authority that Gabriel felt her fight-to-fight response instantly triggered. He didn't look like a worried father. He looked like a general stepping onto a battlefield. Mateo turned, gasped, and launched himself from Gabriel's arms, running to Lorenzo. Lorenzo scooped the 4-year-old up effortlessly, burying his face in the boy's neck for a brief, vulnerable second before his cold mask snapped back into place. Gabrielle stood up, brushing off her knees. "I found him crying," she stammered, intimidated by the 4 massive men who had suddenly formed a wall behind the tall man. He was terrified. I just tried to calm him down. Lorenzo didn't say a word. He looked at Gabrielle, really looked at her. He took in her wavy chestnut hair. Her hazel eyes widened in apprehension, the nervous flutter of her pulse at the base of her throat. His gaze was analytical, cold, and searching. It made Gabrielle feel as though she were being dissected on a table. "Thank you," Lorenzo finally said. The words sounded foreign in his mouth, clipped and sharp. Without waiting for a response, he turned on his heel. His security detail immediately closed in around him, and the boy moving in a tight, protective diamond formation toward the VIP exit. The IP. Gabrielle stood by the fountain, entirely bewildered. She hadn't even gotten his name. As Lorenzo stepped into the back of his armored SUV, he handed the sleeping Mateo to his nanny in the adjacent seat. The door slammed shut. The world outside went quiet behind the bulletproof glass. Dominic slid into the front passenger seat, looking through the rearview mirror. "Kid's okay, Enzo," security team from the mall has been dealt with. They won't lose him again." Lorenzo stared out the tinted window, watching the revolving doors of the Galleria. The echo of the woman's voice was still ringing in his ears. It felt like a ghost had reached out and grabbed him by the throat. There were no coincidences in his world. In the Mafia, a coincidence was just an assassination plot you hadn't figured out yet. "Dominic," Lorenzo said, his voice deadly quiet. "D." "Yeah, boss. The woman by the fountain." Lorenzo ordered, his eyes narrowing into dark, calculating slits. "Get the more security footage. Run her face through every database. I want to know where she works, where she sleeps, who she talks to, and what she had for breakfast. Find everything about her by tonight." 72 hours later, Gabrielle Montgomery felt like she was losing her mind. It started with small, imperceptible things. On Wednesday morning, she noticed a black Lincoln Navigator eyed Lincoln across the street from her modest apartment building in Lincoln Park. She thought nothing of it, but when she left the pediatric clinic where she worked at 6 o'clock in the evening, the says, a vehicle was parked near the subway entrance. On Thursday, her favorite barista at the corner coffee shop casually mentioned that a scary-looking guy in a nice suit had been asking if she was a regular. By Friday evening, Gabrielle was hyperventilating in her kitchen, peering through the blinds of her window. The street was empty, but the feeling of being watched was a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. She poured herself a glass of cheap Cabernet and tried to rationalize. "You are a pediatric speech therapist, Gabrielle. The most dramatic thing you've done this year is argue with an insurance company over a child's C-clear implant coverage. Nobody is stalking you." Meanwhile, 10 miles away, in a high-rise penthouse overlooking the glittering skyline, Lorenzo Costa was staring at a sprawling corkboard, usually reserved for mapping out rival territories or federal indictments. The board was currently dominated by a single 8:10 photograph of Gabrielle Montgomery. Dominic stood on the other side of the mahogany desk, dropping a thick manila folder onto the surface. "Her name is Gabrielle Rosa Montgomery," Dominic said, reading from his tablet. 28, born in Boston, moved to Chicago 3 years ago. Number criminal record. Hell, she doesn't even have a parking ticket. She graduated top of her class from Boston University. Works as a speech pathologist, specializing in early childhood trauma at the Oakwood Clinic. Lorenzo picked up the folder, his eyes scanning the detailed background check. Family. Mother died of breast cancer when she was 12. Father is a retired high school history teacher in Massachusetts. No siblings. Dominic paused, scratching his jaw. "Enzo, my guys have tossed her apartment while she was at work, cloned her phone, and checked her bank accounts. She makes 60 grand a year and spends most of it on student loans and cat food. She's exactly who she appears to be, a civilian." Lorenzo threw the folder onto the desk in frustration. "Then, how did she know the song Dom Tell Me That?" Dominic sighed. "We dug into her grandmother, Rosa Fior. She immigrated from Sicily in 1968 from San Jose, the exact same village your mother was from." The village froze. The village. It was a place with fewer than 1,000 people nestled in the treacherous mountains where the old Mafia wars had stained the cobblestones red. Did her grandmother have ties to the Moretti family? Lorenzo asked, his voice dropping an octave. The Moretts were Lorenzo's oldest and most violent rivals. They had orchestrated the hit on his mother. If Gabrielle was somehow connected to them, if she was a deep cover plant sent to manipulate Mateo to get to him, he would have to eliminate her tonight. "No ties we can find," Dominic replied carefully. "But Enzo, it's a small village. Maybe the song wasn't just your mother's. Maybe it was an old village tale, and your mother and her grandmother both heard it growing up. It could just be a wild one in a billion coincidence." Lorenzo walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city he owned. He didn't believe in one in a billion. The woman had bypassed his $1 million security detail, neutralized a terrified child, and struck a psychological chord so deep within Lorenzo that he hadn't slept in 3 days. She was a loose end, a variable he couldn't control. Pull the surveillance team back, Lorenzo finally said, turning around. Dominic looked surprised. You want us to drop it? No, Lorenzo said softly, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. I'm going to handle her myself. I need to look her in the eyes. I need to see if she's lying. The Oakwood Pediatric Clinic was unusually quiet on Monday morning. Gabriel was sitting in her small pastel, painted office, organizing flashcards for her next appointment, desperately trying to shake off the lingering paranoia of the weekend. The black SUVs seemed to have vanished. She finally convinced herself that she was just watching too many true crime documentaries. At 10:15 a.m., the clinic's receptionist, a bubbly girl named Sarah, knocked on Gabriel's open door. Hey, Gabriel. You have a walk-in consultation, Sarah said, looking slightly flushed. He's a VIP referral from Dr. Pendleton. Cashier says he needs an evaluation for his nephew. A walk-in, Sarah. You know I'm booked solid. Gabriel sighed, standing up and smoothing down her cardigan. I know, but Dr. Pendleton said to make an exception. The uncle is well. He's very persuasive. They're in room 3. Gabriel grabbed her clipboard and walked down the brightly lit hallway. She pushed open the door to examination room 3 with a practiced, welcoming smile. Good morning. I'm Gabrielle Montgomery. I'll be doing that. The clipboard slipped from her fingers, clattering loudly against the linoleum floor. Sitting in the small plastic chair, meant for parents, was the giant, terrifying man from the Galleria. Lorenzo Costa looked entirely absurd in the brightly colored, child-friendly room. His dark suit was immaculate. His presence so overbearing it seemed to suck the oxygen from the space. Sitting quietly on the examination table, swinging his legs, was Mateo. Lorenzo didn't flinch when the clipboard dropped. He slowly stood up, towering over Gabriel. Miss Montgomery, Lorenzo said smoothly, his dark eyes locking onto hers. We didn't get a chance to properly introduce ourselves last week. I am Lorenzo Duca. This is my nephew, Mateo. Gabrielle's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Duca. It was an alias, but she didn't know that. She only knew that this man radiated danger, and the fact that he was suddenly in her private workplace was not a coincidence. Mr. Duca, Gabriel managed to choke out, bending down to retrieve her clipboard, using the movement to hide her shaking hands. What a surprise. How did you find me? You dropped your business card at the fountain. Lorenzo lied effortlessly, not breaking eye contact. I wanted to properly thank you for your help, and as it turns out, Mateo's pediatrician recommended speech therapy. He has been selectively mute since a family tragedy. Gabriel looked at the boy. Mateo offered a tiny, shy wave. Her professional empathy warred with her primal terror. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to be the clinical professional. I see, Gabriel said, stepping into the room and closing the door behind her. Well, selective mutism is a trauma response. Has he spoken since the incident at the mall? Only in Italian, Lorenzo said, taking a step closer to Gabriel. The scent of him, expensive sandalwood, dark coffee, and something sharply metallic enveloped her, which is fascinating considering you managed to calm him with a song that hasn't been sung in 50 years. There it was, the trap. Gabriel frowned, holding her ground despite every instinct, screaming at her to run. It's a song my grandmother taught me. She was from Sicily. Is that why you're really here, Mr. Duca? To interrogate me about a lullaby? Lorenzo's gaze hardened. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate whisper. My world is a very complicated one, Miss Montgomery. People do not bump into me by accident. People do not know the things you know by accident. I came here to figure out exactly what kind of game you are playing." Gabrielle stared back at him, anger suddenly piercing through her fear. "I don't play games, Mr. Duca. I help children. If you brought your nephew here to get him help, I will do my job. If you brought him here to intimidate, a woman who did nothing but keep him safe, in a mall, then you can take your expensive suit and leave my clinic immediately." Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Lorenzo searched her hazel eyes for any sign of deception, any flicker of a hidden agenda. He saw nothing but genuine, righteous indignation. She wasn't an assassin. She wasn't a spy. She was exactly what the file said. A strange, unfamiliar feeling flickered in Lorenzo's chest. Respect. No one spoke to him like that. Men had been buried under concrete for less. Before Lorenzo could respond, his cell phone vibrated violently in his breast pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was an emergency code from Dominic. Lorenzo's demeanor instantly shifted from intimidating to purely lethal. "Our consultation is over, Miss Montgomery. We will be in touch." He grabbed Mateo, gently hoisting him onto his hip, and strode out of the room without looking back. Gabrielle collapsed against the wall, her legs finally giving out. She spent the rest of the day in a daze going through the motions with her other patients, desperate to go home and lock her doors. At 7 p.m., a heavy rainstorm broke over Chicago. Gabrielle rushed out the back exit of the clinic, popping open her umbrella and hurrying toward the employee parking garage. The structure was dim, the flickering fluorescent lights casting long, eerie shadows. As she reached her battered Honda Civic, she noticed the driver's side window was completely shattered. Glass littered the wet pavement. "What the ghoul?" Gabrielle whispered, reaching into her purse for her phone to call the police. Suddenly, a heavy gloved hand clamped down brutally over her mouth. Another arm wrapped around her waist, lifting her entirely off her feet. She kicked and screamed, but the sound was muffled against the thick leather of the glove. "Don't make a sound, sweetheart." A rough, scarred voice hiss Ed in her ear. "Enzo Costa suddenly cares about a pretty little civilian. The Moretti family wants to know why." A needle pierced the side of her neck. The cold rush of a sedative flooded her veins as the dark parking garage began to spin and fade into absolute black. Gabriel's last thought was a terrifying realization. Lorenzo hadn't brought the danger to her. He had exposed her to the monsters waiting in the dark. The storm that hammered Chicago. That Monday night was unforgiving sheets of freezing rain, turning the city streets into slick black rivers inside the Costa family's fortified estate. In Gold Coast, Lorenzo stood by the massive arched windows of his study, watching the lightning fracture the skyline. He held a crystal tumbler of amber bourbon, but he hadn't taken a single sip. His mind was stuck on a loop, replaying the defiance in Gabrielle Montgomery's hazel eyes. If you brought him here to intimidate a woman who did nothing but keep him safe in a mall, then you can take your expensive suit and leave my clinic immediately. In his 32 years of life, surrounded by sycophants, assassins, and hardened criminals, no one had ever spoken to him with such raw, unfiltered honesty. She wasn't an operative, she was a civilian, a woman who sang old Sicilian labae to terrified children and drove a rusted Honda Civic. And Lorenzo, in his paranoia, had walked right into her workplace and painted a massive target on her back. The heavy mahogany doors to the study burst open. Dominic didn't knock. His trench coat was soaked, his chest heaving. Enzo. Lorenzo turned his grip on the crystal tumbler, tightening. "What?" "It's the girl, Gabrielle," Dominic said, his voice unusually tight. "My guys were doing a routine perimeter check after you pulled the main surveillance detail. We found her car in the clinic's parking garage. Driver's side window is smashed. Her purse was left on the passenger seat, but her cell phone is gone. So is she." The crystal tumbler in Lorenzo's hand shattered. Bourbon and blood dripped onto the imported Persian rug. Lorenzo didn't feel the glass slicing into his palm. A cold, absolute void opened up in his chest, instantly swallowing all reason and replacing it with a terrifying primal violence. "Who?" Lorenzo asked. The word was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of an execution order. Tire tracks indicate a heavy utility van. We pulled the street cams a block away. A black Ford Transit sped out of the alley 3 minutes after she ended her shift. Dominic explained, pulling out a tablet. The plates are stolen, but the routing pattern. They headed southwest toward the industrial district. Enzo, it's the Moret. Silas Greco's crew was spotted moving through that sector 2 hours ago. Silas Greco, the Moretti family's chief sadist. A man who specialized in extracting information from rival soldiers using a blowtorch and a pair of pliers. The image of Gabriel's warm, gentle hands holding his nephew flashed through his mind, quickly replaced by the horrifying thought of those same hands bound by Silas Greco. The Morets had seen Lorenzo leave the clinic. They didn't know who Gabrielle was, but they knew Lorenzo Costa had taken a personal interest in her in the Mafia leverage was currency, and they thought they had just kidnapped the bank. "Call everyone," Lorenzo commanded, his voice devoid of any human emotion. He walked over to his desk, ignoring his bleeding hand, and pulled open the bottom drawer. He extracted a matte black Glock 19 and slammed a loaded magazine into the grip. "I want the streets locked down, bribe the dispatchers, buy off the Port Authority, threaten the precinct captains. Nobody gets in or out of the Southwest District. Boss, if we mobilize the entire family for a civilian..." Dominic hesitated, stepping forward. "The Commission will notice. It's an act of all-out war. The treaty with the Morets will be dead." Lorenzo racked the slide of the pistol. The metallic clack echoed loudly in the cavernous study. He looked up at Dominic, his dark eyes entirely hollowed out, burning with a lethal fire. "Then let it die," Lorenzo said quietly. "If a single hair on her head is harmed, I'm going to burn the Moretti family to ash, and I will salt the earth where their houses stood. Get the cars ready. We are going hunting." 20 minutes later, a convoy of 6 black armored SUVs tore through the rain-slicked streets of Chicago. Lorenzo sat in the back of the lead vehicle, wrapping a piece of gauze tightly around his bleeding palm. The silence in the car was suffocating. Every man in the vehicle knew that tonight blood would run in the streets. Dominic was in the passenger seat, a radio pressed to his ear. "Enzo, we got a hit. One of our port scouts saw a black Ford Transit pull into the old abandoned cold storage facility on 43rd and Rhine. 4 armed men outside. Tell the men no warning shots," Lorenzo ordered. "We breach hard and fast. Silas Greco is mine." Gabrielle awoke to the agonizing sensation of ice water being thrown against her face. She gasped, her lungs convulsing as she desperately sucked in air. Her head throbbed with a vicious chemical hangover from the sedative. She blinked rapidly, her vision swinging in and out of focus. The air smelled of rust, ammonia, and old blood. As her eyes adjusted to the dim flickering overhead light, she realized she was sitting on a metal folding chair, her wrists tightly bound behind her with thick plastic zip ties. The plastic bit painfully into her skin. "Welcome back to the land of the living, Miss Montgomery." A raspy, amused voice echoed through the cavernous room. Gabrielle turned her head, wincing at the stiffness in her neck. Stepping out of the shadows was a man in his late 40s. He was entirely bald, wearing a cheap leather jacket with a jagged white scar running from his left ear down to his jawline. Subsure, he dragged a second metal chair across the concrete floor and sat down backward, resting his arms on the back. "Rest. Where am I?" Gabrielle croaked, her throat feeling like sandpaper. "Who are you?" "My name is Silas." The man smiled, though the expression didn't reach his dead, predatory eyes. "As for where you are, well, you're off the map, sweetheart. Now we can make this very quick and painless." or we can make it an entire evening's worth of entertainment. I prefer the latter, but I'm on a tight schedule. Tell me what your relationship is with Lorenzo Costa." Gabriel's brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "Who? I don't know anyone named Lorenzo Costa." Silas chuckled, reaching into his jacket and pulling out a silver butterfly knife. He flicked his wrist, the blade flashing in the dim light. "Don't play stupid with me. We've been watching Costa for months, the untouchable ghost of Chicago. The man doesn't step foot outside his fortress without a 1-0-man detail. Yet today he walks into a civilian pediatric clinic to have a private chat with a speech therapist. You're either his accountant, his mistress, or you're holding something he wants. You're insane." Gabriel breathed the pieces slowly, terrifyingly clicking together. Lorenzo Duca, the expensive suits, the armored cars, the armed men at the Galleria. He hadn't just been a wealthy uncle. He was a Mafia boss, the most dangerous man in the city. He told me his name was Duca. Gabrielle cried out, her voice trembling, but her mind racing. Her training kicked in. She analyzed Silas's speech, the slight lateral lisp on his S sounds, the rapid cadence indicating high adrenaline. He was anxious. He wanted information fast, which meant he was scared to rid of whoever this Lorenzo Costa really was. "Duca," Silas laughed. A harsh barking sound. "He gave you a fake name. Wow, he really kept you in the dark. That's unfortunate for you, Gabriel, because right now my boss wants to know why Costa cares about you. And if you don't give me a satisfactory answer in the next 30 seconds, I'm going to start taking off your fingers." Silas stood up, stepping closer, the tip of the knife resting lightly against Gabriel's collarbone. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but the image of her grandmother flashed in her mind. Rosa had survived the bombings of World War II in Sicily. She hadn't raised Gabriel to die weeping in a Chicago meatpacking plant. "I don't know anything about his business," Gabriel said, her voice dropping into a steady, flat tone, forcing Silas to listen closely. "I found his nephew crying in a mall. I sang him a lullaby in Italian. That's it. That's the grand conspiracy. You kidnapped a speech therapist because a 4-year-old got lost near a fountain." Silas stared at her, the knife hovering over her skin. He looked for the lie, but Gabriel held his gaze, her hazel eyes blazing with defiant anger. "A lie," Silas scoffed, shaking his head. "You expect me to tell my boss that Lorenzo Costa risked exposure over a lullaby? You're lying." He raised the knife. Gabriel squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the agony. Suddenly, the heavy steel doors at the far end of the warehouse exploded inward with a deafening crash. The blast wave knocked Silas off his feet, sending him crashing into a stack of wooden pallets. The overhead lights shattered, plunging the warehouse into near total darkness, illuminated only by the strobing flashes of tactical flashlights cutting through the dust and smoke. Gunfire erupted. It was a localized war zone. Gabriel screamed, throwing herself into the chair's side, Ivways, crashing onto the cold concrete floor to make herself as small a target as possible. The sound of automatic weapons was deafening, echoing off the corrugated metal walls. She heard men shouting in Italian and English, the sickening thud of bodies hitting the floor, and the sharp scent of cordite filling the air. It lasted exactly 45 seconds, then dead silence. Gabriel lay on the floor, her heart hammering so hard she thought her ribs would crack. She heard heavy, deliberate footsteps approaching her in the dark. "Stay back," Gabriel yelled, kicking out blindly with her boots. A flashlight beam hit the floor near her, providing enough ambient light to see the towering silhouette stepping over the bodies of Silas's men. It was Lorenzo. He looked like a demon stepped straight out of mythology. His expensive suit was soaked with rain, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. In his right hand he held a suppressed pistol. His chest was heaving and his eyes were walled, frantic, searching the shadows until they locked onto her. Lorenzo dropped the gun. It clattered against the concrete. He fell to his knees beside her, his large calloused hands urgently checking her face, her neck, her arms for injuries. His breathing was ragged. "Gabrielle," he breathed, his voice stripped of all its cold authority, leaving only a raw, desperate relief. "Seferita, are you hurt?" "No," Gabriel stammered, shrinking back, slightly terrified of the violence radiating from him. "You lied to me. You're a mobster." Lorenzo didn't deny it. He pulled a tactical combat knife from his belt and sliced through the thick zip ties, binding her wrists with one fluid motion. As soon as her hands were free, Gabriel scrambled backward until her back hit a concrete pillar. "Don't touch me," she gasped, rubbing her bruised wrists, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes. "This is your fault. They thought I was your mistress. They were going to kill me to get to you." Lorenzo froze. The word struck him harder than any bullet could have. He looked around the blood-soaked warehouse, then back at the beautiful, innocent woman shivering in the dirt. He had sworn to protect his family from this life, and instead he had dragged an absolute stranger straight into hell. "You're right," Lorenzo said softly. "So, the lethal monster receding, leaving behind the man drowning in guilt." He slowly took off his wet, heavy suit jacket and held it out to her. "It is my fault, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure nothing like this ever happens to you again. But right now we need to leave. More of them will come." "Proud." Proud Gabriel looked at the jacket, then up at his dark, intense eyes. The blind wolf from her lullaby wasn't a myth. He was kneeling right in front of her. The ride back to the Gold Coast was a blur of flashing streetlights and deafening silence. Gabriel sat in the back of the armored SUV, wrapped tightly in Lorenzo's damp suit jacket, her knees pulled to her chest. Lorenzo sat rigidly beside her, his jaw locked, his dark eyes scanning the rain-lashed streets of Chicago, as if expecting an ambush at every intersection. When the heavy iron gates of the Costa estate finally groaned open, revealing a sprawling limestone mansion, heavily guarded by men in dark raincoats, Gabriel felt a fresh wave of exhaustion wash over her. This wasn't a home, it was a fortress. Lorenzo bypassed the grand foyer, leading her directly into a private wood-paneled study that smelled of cedar and old paper. A gay-haired man with a medical bag was already waiting. "Dr. Hayes," Lorenzo said, his voice clipped. "Check her completely. If there is a single scratch on her that you miss, I will hold you personally responsible." "Lorenzo, I'm fine." Gabrielle interrupted her voice, it trembling, but finding its strength. "They just gave me a sedative. I don't need. You will let the doctor examine you," Lorenzo commanded, though the harshness in his tone cracked, revealing the frantic desperation underneath. He refused to leave the room, standing by the fireplace with his arms crossed, watching like a hawk, as Dr. Hayes checked her vitals, shined a light in her eyes, and carefully applied a soothing salve to the angry red marks around her wrists. Once the doctor declared her physically unharmed and left the room, the heavy mahogany doors clicked shut. They were alone. Gabrielle stood up from the leather sofa. She was entirely out of her element, shivering in her torn work clothes. Yet she refused to cower. "You owe me the truth," she demanded, her hazel eyes locking onto his. "Not the half-truths, not the intimidation tactics. Why did the Moretti family kidnap me? Why did a lullaby make you risk your entire syndicate?" Lorenzo poured a fresh glass of bourbon, his hand trembling imperceptibly. He downed it in one swallow before turning to face her. "Because in my world there is no such thing as a coincidence." Lorenzo began, his voice dropping into a low, growly timbre. "My mother sang that exact version of the song to me when I was a child. The lyrics about the blind wolf. She invented them to drown out the sounds of the men trying to kick our apartment door down in Sicily. When she was murdered 15 years ago by the Moretti family, that song died with her." "Or so I thought." Gabriel frowned, her mind racing back to her grandmother, Rosa. My grandmother taught it to me. She lived a quiet life in Boston. She baked bread and went to Mass. She wasn't involved in the Mafia. Lorenzo walked slowly to his heavy oak desk, pulling out a faded leather-bound journal. He tossed it gently onto the coffee table in front of Gabrielle. Dominic tore through the old village, records in San Jose. Lorenzo said softly, "Your grandmother Rosa Fior didn't just immigrate to America for a better life, Gabriel. She fled. 50 years ago, the Costa family was nearly wiped out in a territorial war. My grandfather was the Dawn. He was ambushed and left for dead in the streets." Gabriel stared at the worn journal, her breath catching in her throat. "Rosa found him." Lorenzo continued stepping closer until he was mere inches from her, his towering presence casting a long shadow. "She dragged my grandfather into her cellar and hid him from the hitmen for 3 days. She nursed him back to health. When the rival families found out, they put a bounty on her head. My grandfather smuggled her onto a boat to Boston to save her life." He swore a blood oath that the Costa family would forever be indebted to the Fior bloodline. Gabriel's legs felt weak. She sat back down heavily on the sofa. "She never told my father. She never told me. She was protecting you," Lorenzo said, crouching down in front of her so they were eye level. The cold, ruthless Mafia boss was entirely gone, replaced by a man humbled by the ghosts of his past. My mother must have known the story. She must have known the song Rosa used to sing in the village, and she adapted it for me. You didn't just save Mateo in that mall. Gabriel, you are the granddaughter of the woman who saved my family's legacy. You are untouchable. Tears pricked Gabriel's eyes. The crushing weight of the revelation settled over her. But the Moretts don't know that. They just see me as a pawn, Silas said. She shuddered, remembering the cold steel of the knife against her collarbone. He said I was leverage. Lorenzo's expression hardened into a mask of pure lethal ice. He reached out his warm, calloused fingers, gently brushing a stray lock of chestnut hair behind her ear. The touch sent a jolt of electricity straight to her core. Silas Greco will never speak another word in this life. Lorenzo whispered his thumb, tracing her jawline. And by tomorrow morning, the Moretti family will cease to exist. I am going to burn their empire to the ground for daring to lay a hand on you. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in calculated absolute annihilation, while, the city of Chicago remained completely oblivious to the shadow wall raging beneath its streets. Gabriel Montgomery was sequestered inside the heavily fortified guest wing of the Costa estate. The suite was breathtaking vated ceilings, Persian rugs and bulletproof floor to siling windows overlooking the turbulent gray waters of Lake Michigan. Yet despite the luxury, the air was thick with the suffocating reality of her situation. She was guarded around the clock. Dominic's men, wearing tailored suits that poorly concealed their shoulder holsters, stood perfectly still at the end of every corridor. Gabrielle paced the length of the hardwood floor until her feet ached, jumping at every muffled ring of a telephone or distant slam of a heavy oak door. Her only solace was Mateo. The 4-year-old had been brought to her suite on the second morning, his nanny explaining apologetically that the boy had refused to eat or sleep, pointing frantically toward the wing where Gabriel was being held. From the moment he toddled into the room, he latched onto her. Gabriel's clinical instinct seamlessly merged with a fiercely protective maternal drive. They spent hours sitting on the floor building intricate towers out of imported wooden blocks and reading vintage children's books Gabriel had requested from the estate's massive library. It was during a quiet Tuesday afternoon, while the rain relentlessly battered the reinforced glass, that the profound shift happened. Gabriel was absent-mindedly stroking Mateo's dark hair as he rested his head on her lap. She was quietly humming the Sicilian lullaby, the very song that had ignited this entire war. Suddenly, Mateo shifted. He looked up at her, his dark eyes so hauntingly similar to Lorenzo's wide and searching. He reached out a tiny hand, his fingers grazing the silver locket Gabriel wore around her neck. "Are you going away?" Gabriel stopped breathing. The blocks slipped from her hand, clattering against the floor. He had spoken in perfect crystal-clear English. The Tremaine-induced mutism that had locked him in total silence since his mother's brutal murder had finally cracked. Tears immediately flooded Gabriel's vision, spilling hot and fast down her cheeks. She gently cupped the boy's small face, her heart aching with a profound, overwhelming love for a child she had met only a week ago. "No, sweetheart," Gabriel whispered, her voice trembling but thick with a sudden, immovable conviction. "I am right here, and I'm not going anywhere." Miles away at the desolate shipping yards along the Calumet River, Lorenzo Costa was fulfilling a much darker promise. The rain was freezing, turning the industrial docks into a slick, treacherous nightmare. Lorenzo stood under the corrugated metal awning of a massive storage warehouse, his long black overcoat whipping in the wind. At his feet lay Carmen Moretti, the aging, ruthless patriarch of the rival family. For the past 48 hours, Lorenzo hadn't slept. He had moved through the city like an apex predator, systematically severing every artery of the Moretti empire. He hadn't just relied on brute force. He had used the full, terrifying weight of his intellect. Lorenzo had frozen Carmine's offshore accounts, blackmailed the corrupt federal judges on the Moretti payroll, and intercepted 3 of their largest international shipments in a single night. By the time Lorenzo's men breached this warehouse, Carmine's final sanctuary, the rival Dawn had nothing left. His lieutenants had fled or surrendered. His empire was ashes. Carmine spat a mouthful of blood onto the wet concrete, glaring up at Lorenzo. "You broke the Commission's treaty over a woman." The old man rasped, his breathing labored. "You're a fool, Costa. You burned decades of peace for a nobody." Lorenzo didn't blink. His expression was carved from granite, his eyes as cold and unforgiving as the river behind them. He slowly crouched down, resting his forearms on his knees, bringing his face inches from the man who had ordered the hit on his mother 15 years ago. "She is not a nobody," Lorenzo said, his voice dropping to a lethal vibrating whisper that sent a chill through his own men standing nearby. "Her name is Gabriel Rosa Montgomery. Her grandmother was Rosa Fior, the woman who saved my grandfather's life in San Jose Jato." Carmine's eyes widened in sudden absolute terror, the color completely drained from his weathered face. Every man in the old Sicilian syndicates knew the legend of the Fior blood oath. It was sacred. To lay a hand on that bloodline was to invite the wrath of God himself. "You didn't just touch a civilian Carmine," Lorenzo continued, standing back up and adjusting the cuffs of his coat. "You desecrated a holy pact, and for that your name will be erased from this city." Lorenzo turned his back on the broken man and walked toward his idling, armored SUV. He didn't look back when the deafening crack of Dominic's pistol echoed through the empty shipping yard. The Moretti family was dead. When Lorenzo finally returned to the Gold Coast estate, it was past midnight. The storm had finally broken, leaving the city washed in an eerie, silent calm. He bypassed his study and walked directly up the grand staircase toward the guest wing. He felt a bone-deep exhaustion radiating through his muscles. His new talons were bruised, his white dress shirt stained with grease, and a faint smear of blood at the collar. He felt toxic. He felt like a monster. He had no business stepping into the light. He gently pushed open the heavy oak door to Gabriel's suite. The room was dimly lit by the embers of the fireplace. Gabriel was standing by the window, wrapped in a thick cashmere shawl, staring out at the distant, glittering skyline. She turned as he entered her hazel eyes, locking onto his. She didn't flinch at his disheveled, dangerous appearance. Instead, she took a step toward him. "It's over," Lorenzo said, his voice rough, stripped of all its commanding authority. "The Morettis are dismantled. They will never be a threat to you again." Gabriel exhaled a long, shaky breath, crossing her arms over her chest. "And you? Are you hurt?" The genuine concern in her voice felt like a physical blow to his chest. He didn't deserve it. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a thick, pristine white envelope, placing it deliberately on the small glass table between them. "What is that?" Gabriel asked, her brow furrowing. "A first-class plane ticket to Geneva. A new passport with a clean, untraceable identity, and the route-in numbers to a secure Swiss bank account containing $5 million. Lorenzo stated his tone aggressively, clinical to mask the agonizing pain tearing through him. "My grandfather swore an oath to protect your family. I failed you by pulling you straight into the center of my storm. This is your way out, Gabriel. You can walk away tonight. You will be safe, you will be wealthy, and you will never have to look over your shoulder again. Or look at a man like me ever again." Gabriel stared at the thick white envelope resting on the table. It represented everything a rational, clear-minded person would want. It was freedom. It was an escape from the suffocating darkness of the Chicago underworld. It was a golden parachute lifting her far away from the violence that clung to Lorenzo like a second skin. She slowly looked up at him. Lorenzo stood perfectly rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly that a muscle feathered rhythmically in his cheek. He was a man who commanded thousands, who ruled this city with an iron fist wrapped in silence. Yet right now, he was bracing himself for a fatal wound, waiting for her to walk away, because he genuinely and completely believed he was poison to her. Gabriel slowly crossed the room toward the glass table. She picked up the envelope. The heavy silence stretched between them until it felt as though every molecule of oxygen had been quietly sucked from the air. Then, with deliberate and unhurried movements, Gabriel gripped the thick paper firmly and tore the envelope cleanly in half. Lorenzo's breath hitched, his eyes snapped to her hands in pure disbelief. "What the hell are you doing?" Gabriel let the torn pieces fall silently to the floor. She stepped directly into his space, completely ignoring the sharp scent of ozone, rain, and danger that clung to him like a shadow. She reached up slowly, resting her soft, warm palm against his bruised cheek. He flinched instinctively, but then leaned into her touch, a low and ragged sigh escaping his lips as his eyes fluttered shut. "I have spent my entire life helping traumatized children find their voices," Gabriel said softly, her thumb brushing with quiet tenderness over his cheekbone. "Mateo spoke to me today, Lorenzo, in English. He looked me in the eyes and asked me if I was going to leave him." Lorenzo's dark eyes snapped open wide with complete disbelief. He spoke, "Yes, and what did you tell him?" Gabriel held his gaze without wavering. "I told him that the blind wolf would protect us both. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe to your channel. Table number 6. It truly means the world to us. And wherever you're watching from around the globe, drop your country's name down in the comments. We absolutely love seeing where our incredible viewers are tuning in from.